Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Bava Batra Daf Kuf Samach. We're going to get started. I'll just tell everyone to save the date right now, which is the Siyum will be on Wednesday night, December 18th. And details will go up in the next day or two. So put it down in your calendars. We are going to get started, which means we're getting near the end of the Masechet. We're starting the last chapter. And as I mentioned yesterday, this last chapter is a little bit different than the rest of the chapters. It's sort of, I would say, almost like an appendix to, you can even say maybe even all of the Bavas, but particularly our Masechet, which dealt a lot more with documentation of sales and of rentals and then the Shchib Meira. In fact, Tosfot, it's just interesting to note how different commentaries focus on different things. Tosfot often likes to ask the question of order. Okay? A lot of the commentaries aren't so interested in that, but Tosfot often asks, like, what is this doing here? So if you look at Tosfot, toward the end of the first Tosfot on the daf, he says, "Dahacha agav detana perik mishamet bekotev shtar shkatav kol nechasav b'briut u'b'shchib meira." Since in the previous chapter we were talking about somebody who writes a document with all their, with the gifts, whether healthy or whether sick, Tanahacha get pashut ari b'shtarot. And therefore, once they were talking about documentation, so they went to, okay, let's talk about documents and let's go through. And this chapter is going to deal mostly with all different issues about different kinds of, like, we're going to start with different types of documents and then other issues relating to documents and witnesses in the documents. So with that, we'll get started with our chapter. Get pashut. Now you might be saying, what are we doing with gets, right? We're in the middle of Seder Nezikin. Why get? So the word get, you might remember, is not just a divorce document, even though nowadays that's what we call a get, is a divorce document. And then it was also called a divorce document, but a get is also a general term for a document. It's like a synonym for shtar. It's the same thing. So they just happen to call it get here. They could have called it shtar. Doesn't really matter. It's all one and the same. And it doesn't mean only a get here. It means a shtar. Now you might think that they called it a get, and you'll see why, because the whole origins of what we're going to learn about a get mekushar comes from get, actual get, what we call a divorce document. So get pashut edav mitocho, mekushar edav me'achorav. We're going to get, the Mishnah is going to talk about a get pashut and a get mekushar. We're going to have to understand what they are. A get pashut, the Rashbam says very simply, shtar pashut kein shelanu. Okay, that's just a document. That's why it's called a shtar pashut. Pashut means simple. It's a simple document, which basically means you write down the text on top. There's a date. There's the information, the important stuff. If you remember, we learned in Gittin about there's the Torah and there's the Tofes. The Torah for the things that are unique to this document and very important details like the date, the names of the people, the names of the place it was written, all that. And then there's the Tofes, which is the stuff that goes into every document of this type, okay, like the details, that are kind of basic. Again, what exactly is in the Tofes, what is in the Torah is a good question. There's not total agreement about everybody about all that, but we'll leave that issue aside. So that's the basic. You have the details, and then you have the signatures at the bottom. And if you think about whenever we write a check, for example, okay, people don't write so many checks anymore, but even when they do, it's often issued by the bank. You do it on the computer. But when we used to write checks, okay, or maybe still do, you always have to make sure that after the last zero, there's something written so that nobody adds another zero. So we're going to talk about that issue today as well. That's why the agent would always sign right under the text, and that would prevent any sort of forgeries or people adding something into the text later that won't be to the benefit of one of the sides of, the case here of the document. So get pashut edav mitocho. So the witnesses are inside, meaning you write the document, the witness is signed at the bottom. Okay, very plain and simple. Mekushar, but a get that's called a mekushar, a tied get, which actually we learned about back in Masechet Gittin, edav me'achorav. The simple reading of this is the edim are on the back side of the document, which we're going to have to deal with what exactly is this and how this works. So this is like an accordion. Again, mekushar, I made a little an example here. Okay, you would write. Now, there's a bit of a problem with explaining this, and the problem is we're going to see the machloket emoraim, even like where the witness is signed exactly. How did this work? Why is there such confusion about this? Because it seems pretty clear that after the time of the Tanaim, and even we're going to see a case with Rebbe where like he didn't even understand how a get mekushar worked, that people didn't use this anymore. It started at a certain point in history, which we'll talk about. We won't get a date, but there was some incident that caused this get mekushar to be, I don't know, created, but used. But it seems like nobody really used it after that. And therefore, it's very confusing. Like nobody really knows what it looked like. Because if we knew what it looked like, it would be pretty obvious. Like we know that a document is signed and you have witnesses at the bottom that sign. There's text because that's the way all documents are written, right? Or if you want to know Jewish documents, so go look at your ketubah, go look at a divorce document, go look at whatever documents you might ever see. So you can see how they're written. There's text, there's witnesses at the bottom. The get mekushar, since nobody was doing it anymore, and maybe we'll end with the Tosfot, who tries to say, like, if this was instituted as takana of the rabbis, which we're going to get to, we'll have to wait patiently to understand why they even started with this complicated get mekushar, unless you remember, because we learned it already. So what Tosfot tries to say, why don't we use this anymore? And if it was a takana instituted by the rabbis, shouldn't we be using it in the cases where they instituted it? And he tries to offer 3 reasons, but it's more interesting his question. Like, what happened to this? So anyway, that's just also to explain why it's going to be a little confusing to figure out what this is, because nobody really saw one, so nobody knew exactly how it worked. So the way it works, okay, again, I'm going to give you like one of the interpretations, because not everyone agrees with this. These were basically at the folds, they're lines. So there would be one line of text and then a blank line. And then you would close it. Okay, which line was the one that was blank and which was the one not blank? Also, there's a disagreement about. Some people think all the lines were filled in and you folded it. So it's tough to know. But then you would fold that row. Okay, so you would have like 2 lines and it would be folded. Another 2 lines, which, again, according to most commentaries, only one of them had text. Would say like the date and again, the names, the important stuff would be folded. And on every fold, you would tie it. That's why it's called a tie get. And it would be sealed. Okay, you could open it, but it would be kind of closed shut. Okay, we have no idea yet why they use this. We'll get to that later because I don't want to give away the Gemara. We're going to see that on our bet. So we have these 2 types of gets. One is a get pashut, one is a get mekushar. Now we're going to learn the differences. There's halachic differences between them. And so much so that the Mishnah is going to tell you if you do this one in that way or that one in that way, it's no good. So the first difference is where the witnesses are. In the regular get, they're at the bottom on the inside. In the get mekushar, they are on the back side. Okay. The other thing to point out is that even in a mekushar, if you notice, I only folded a few folds because there's only a few folds, and then the bottom part has the tofes part, which is the less important part, and that's just written like a regular document. The only difference is there's no witnesses signing at the bottom, which obviously opens up the question, which we're going to get to toward the end of today's daf. If the eidim are on the back, and depending on where they are on the back, but if they're at the top and the back, then people could add text like the blank check issue, a check with extra space, and then there could be forgeries here. So how did they prevent that? We'll have to get to. So again, first difference is where the witnesses are. Pashut shekatvu edav me'achorav, mekushar shekatvu edav mitocho. If you flipped it and put in a regular document the eidim on the back side, and on the get mekushar you put the eidim on the front side, they're disqualified. But Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel disagrees and says, Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel omer, mekushar shekatvu edav mitocho kashir, mipnei sheyachol lasot hapashut. Again, mekushar, if you open the ties and make it straight, it's just a get pashut. So if you put in the get mekushar the witnesses signed on the inside, that would be fine because you can always just turn it into a get pashut. The problem would be if you have a get pashut with the signatures on the outside, that would never work. He disagrees with Tanakama because Tanakama thinks either way you did it wrong, it's wrong. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel has a third opinion. Hakol kiminhag hamedina. It all goes according to the custom of the land. That's not a very clear answer. And the Rashbam tells us, Gemara mefaresh. Wait with patience, not today, but we'll get to this later in the Gemara. And he also, by the way, points out, in case you're impatient, he says, Tama mekushar mefaresh b'Gemara. Also, why we have a get mekushar will be in the Gemara, why they even started with this. So don't worry, we'll get there. He's kind of telling you, don't think you're supposed to know everything right now. Have patience, we'll get there later. He's a good Gemara teacher, right? Telling you, it's okay, you don't understand. You'll get there later. Now we have another halacha in the Mishnah, another difference between these 2 types of documents. Get pashut edav b'shnayim, mekushar b'shlosha. Okay, regular document, we know 2 signatures, right? That's always, you need 2 edim to sign any document. But the get mekushar needs 3. This is another, okay, again, we don't know why, But again, mekushar needs 3 edim. Pashut shekatuv bo ed echad. If you have a regular document with only one witness, okay, that's obvious. That's not going to be good. And mekushar shekatuv bo shnei edim. If you have a mekushar with only 2 signatures, shnehem psulim. I think what they're trying to tell you here in the first line, even though we all know one witness won't be a good document, you always need 2 witnesses in halacha. But what it means is, I think what they're trying to say is, just like we all know one witness is no good, in a regular get, if you have a get mekushar, and you only have 2 witnesses, that's as if there's one witness for it, right? You're missing a very basic witness, and it doesn't work. And in fact, you might remember, and the Rashbam adds this, that as we learned in Masechet Gitin, that's called a get kereach. Okay, we're learning all sorts of terms today. What a get mekushar and a get kereach. Get kereach is a bald get. And what the Rashbam is telling you, based on the Southern Gemara, that if you, let's say, decided you're going to make 5 folds, okay? For every fold, you need a witness. And if you don't have, so having 4 witnesses on a document with 5 folds, that would be just as disqualified as 1 witness in a get pashut. Okay, you have to have, that's the rule in a get mekushar. For every fold, you need a signature. Now the Gemara is going to start off minahani mile with the question, where do we get in the Torah that there's this concept of get mekushar? It's a bit of a strange question, because get mekushar is actually a rabbinic ordinance, we're going to see. So why they even think to connect it to the psukim is a good question. The structure is going to be like this. We're going to have 3 opinions, 3 verses, 2 from Yirmiyahu, from the same chapter in Yirmiyahu, but 2 different incidents, or 2 different sections of the same chapter, with 2 different topics, I would say, and a pasuk from the Torah. Then the Gemara is going to say, you can't possibly learn it from all those 3 places, because all those are needed for their own issue or for some other issue. And we darshan something else from them, or we learn something else from there, and that you can't learn from there to halakha, to which the Gemara is going to answer, you're right. It's really rabbinic, and they just connected it to psukim. Okay? So now you could say maybe they didn't know it when they started the sugya that it was a rabbinic ordinance. And then after we get through that whole thing, we're going to see why the rabbis instituted this get mekushar. And that's going to take us to finally understanding why we have a get mekushar. And then maybe we'll get to Tosfot, who offers why we don't use it anymore. If the rabbis instituted this, why are we not doing it? So let's start with our Menahani Mile. Where do we get this from? And we're going to have a classic drashot. Okay, you can always ask the question when you have 3 different opinions about where something is learned from, why this one chooses that pasuk and that one chooses that pasuk and that one chooses that one. In other words, what's the difference between these? And I'm not going to offer an answer. I'm just going to tell you, you can always start thinking about that. It could be because later we're going to reject all 3 of them and say, really, you can't learn from here because of this, you can't learn from here from that. You could just easily say this one didn't want to learn from there because that's how we read that pasuk and therefore didn't learn that. But it's always a question that's good to ask, which is, what's the connection of these psukim to the topic and why would one choose one over the other? So Menahani Mile, where do we get it from? Amar Rabbi Chanina da Amar Kra, the pasuk says, Sadot b'kesef yiknu v'chatov b'sefer v'chatom v'ha'ed edim. Okay, this is Yirmiyahu telling the people, you should buy land, right? There's a destruction coming, and it's good to buy land because then when you come back and get a document about it, because you're going to be kicked out of the land, that's what Yirmiyahu is telling them about the destruction that's impending. Remember, Yirmiyahu lived through the destruction. And he's saying when we come back to the land, he's trying to give them a little nechama that they will come back to the land. You want to have documentation to prove what land was yours. So you should buy land and write it down in a book and get it signed. So it says, Sadot b'kesef yiknu, you'll buy fields, v'chatov b'sefer v'chatom, you should write it down in a book and sign it. You might remember these psukim, we learned them with get, about the k'tivan, the chatiman, ede mesira, ede chatima karte, which are the important ones, v'ha'ed edim, and bring witnesses. But notice ha'ed edim is also a double language. Chatov b'sefer v'chatom is a little bit duplicated because often to write means, obviously, if you're writing a document, you're getting it signed, so why do you need to write both? So we're going to darshan all these extra things. So they're starting now, breaking up the pasuk in the classic way of drasha. So go buy fields and write it down in a book, turning now to Amud Bet, ze pashut. Okay, so the first one is the basic one. Write it down in what? That's a get pashut. Hatom ze mekushar. It says v'chatom and sign. That must be adding another type of document. What must that be? A mekushar. V'ha'ed shnayim. Edim shlosha. Why ha'ed edim? Ha'ed is already aid. Now, normally in the Torah, there's a concept. You see this in the Gemara. I assume it comes up in Sanhedrin, but whenever it says aid, it means two witnesses, because every time it's two, right? Every time there's a witness in the Torah, it's always two. So ha'ed already means two witnesses, and edim is shlosha. Okay, plural is already three. So there you have ha'ed edim is a reference to the fact that one has two, one has three. Haketzad, how does this work? Shnayim pashut, shlosha mekushar. Okay, so they assume, right? The two goes together with the pashut, the three goes together with the mekushar. To which the Gemara asks, takana. It's a little arbitrary. Why don't you say it's the reverse? Why don't you say the get pashut needs three and the get mekushar needs two? Well, mitoch shenitraba b'ksharav nitraba ba'edav. And this we're going to do after every single proof we have. All the three sources we're going to say, well, just because one is two and one is three, why is this one two and that one three? The answer is going to always be the same answer, which is since this one has a lot of folds, we assume the folds go and correspond to the witnesses, and therefore we assume there's more witnesses in the get mekushar. Rafram Amar Mehacha. Rafram brings a different proof. Ekach et sefer hamikna ve'et hachatum hamitzvah v'chukim ve'et hagalui. This is when Yirmiyahu himself buys a field from his uncle, and it says, and I took a book and the signed something, right? The signed document, the mitzvah, the chukim. Okay, this sounds like it's adding something else entirely, right? The statutes and hagalui, and the thing that was revealed. Okay, this is very confusing. What does this mean? Well, we're going to darshan it. Ekachat sefer hamikneh ze pashut. Okay, the sefer is just like in the sefer in the previous pasuk. That's the simple one. Et hachatum ze mekushar. Also here. The sealed, right, or signed or sealed, by the way. Hatum could also be sealed, which is what happens with this get mekushar, because we seal it together, right? We tie the folds. Ze mekushar, et hagalui ze pashut shebe mekushar. Now, remember, there's the accordion here at the top, but the bottom is just a regular part. That's the galui, the revealed part of the mekushar tied up document. There's this hidden part. And there's the revealed part. So that shows that there's this extra part to the mekushar. We didn't have a drasha about that in the first pasuk. Ha-mitzvah v'chukim. Now we skipped those words. Now we have to go back and darshan them. Why does it say the mitzvah, the law, and the statutes? Elu dvarim shebein pashut l'mekushar. This is to teach you there's rules about the mekushar and the pashut, that each one is different from the other. And what are they? Well, it doesn't say so in the pasuk, but the fact that it says mitzvah and chukim is an indicator that there's differences between them. So what must those differences be? Well, the ones we already know. The two differences in the Mishnah are referenced by the words, the mitzvah and the chukim. Yes, one matches one difference, one is the other difference, and highlights there's two differences. One is the number of witnesses, and two is where the witnesses sign. Again, they say, why don't we flip it? Right? Why is this one two and that one three? Okay, again, the same answer, because there's more folds, there's more or more parts tied together, there's more witnesses required. Rami Bar Yechezkel brings a third pasuk. Al pi shnayim edim or al pi shlosha edim yakum davar. Pasuk is always a strange pasuk. Okay, you might not think about it, but either by two witnesses or by three witnesses, you shall establish something. Now, here they're talking about testimony, right? Not necessarily written, but could be written also. Anyway, the big question of that pasuk is, if you can establish something with two people, obviously you can establish it with three people, because three people includes two people. So why are we saying I'll be three people? Doesn't make any sense. To which they answer, perfect answer. Right? There's two different types of documents. Some require two, some require three. And with that one drasha, we learn all about get pashut and get mekushar, and the fact that they have a difference between them in terms of how many witnesses. So that's another drasha. V'ipokana, again, why don't we switch it and say the get pashut needs three and the get mekushar needs two? Again, we keep saying the same thing, because there's more folds, there's more signatures required. Now the Gemara is going to ask, as I said, about all three drashot. How could you be saying these psukim are coming for that? These psukim each are coming for their own issue. Okay, how so? L'chidetanya, as it says in a braita, Sadop kesef yiknu b'chatov sefer v'chatom eitza tova kamashmalan. Yirmiyahu was just giving the people good advice. It wasn't saying you have to do it this way and this is the way the shtarot worked. He was just saying, this is what I recommend you do. It's just some good advice. It wasn't a halachic thing. When he took the book and he bought it from his cousin, he bought the land, he wrote it in a book. That's just what he did. It doesn't mean everyone has to do this when they write documents. The whole point of saying Shnayim and Shlosha is actually machlok at the rabbis and Rabbi Akiva in Masechet Makol. We'll get there Bezrat Hashem in a few months. And it's to teach you that 2 is like 3 and 3 is like 2. There's different opinions about what they learn from it. I'm not going to get into that right now, but it's needed for some other drasha. Okay, so this isn't what these 3 psukim are coming to teach you. You can't say this is where we derive the halacha from. To which the Gemara answers, as I kind of told you before, Ela mekushar mide Rabbanan. The fact that there's such a thing as a get mekushar is a rabbinic thing. It came from the rabbis, not from the Torah. Ukrai asmachta ba'alma, and the psukim are just ways of showing a support for this, right? Often we say they're used as a mnemonic, perhaps, to remember that there's this concept of 2 shtarot. If you remember that it says in those psukim, v'chatom b'sefer v'chatom, and ve'ha'ed edim, right? You'll now remember, oh yeah, this one needs 2 edim, this one needs 3. This is that. Okay, so it's just a way to remember or to connect it to psukim, but it's not really derived from there. Okay, because really those psukim are needed for other things. Finally, we get to why did they institute this get mekushar? There was a place, okay, it was a particular historical incident that happened. We don't know when. There was a place with a lot of kohanim, a city of kohanim. V'havu kapde tuva. They were a bunch of short-tempered people, and Migar Nashayu, and they would divorce their wives very quickly. They would get angry and divorce them. Now, what's the problem? If a regular person divorces his wife, as long as she doesn't marry someone in between, he can remarry her. Kohen can't do that because a Kohen can't marry a divorcee, even his own divorcee. So, what would these people do? They get very angry. They divorce their wives very quickly. So, what the rabbis say? Avde Rabbanana takanta adahachi v'hachi miyat v'da'atayu. Well, we're going to make a takana. It's going to take you a long time to get this started, this document together, this get. You're going to have to write it, fold it, seal it, tie it, get more witnesses to sign. That's why also it's going to be more witnesses in that case because it takes longer to find another person to come to sign your document. It's all a delay tactic. And that by the time, in the meanwhile, by the time this document is done, remember, it's not when the document is finished that it's valid. It's once the husband gives it to the wife, by then, hopefully, the man will come down from his anger and decide he doesn't want to divorce his wife. So it was all instituted for this kind of situation, for kohanim, okay? And therefore, it was probably primarily used by kohanim, okay? And therefore, that's why they instituted it in the first place, to which the Gemara asks, Hatinach gitin shtarot ma'ika l'meimar. Okay, so I get why you would do it in a get, but why in a regular document, right? This is, remember, get pashut doesn't, and get mekushar doesn't just mean a get. It means any document. So why would they even have this document for, regular sales, for example? They didn't want to make a differentiation. Okay, so this means probably that in those days, when they instituted this takana, and kohanim would always use a get mekushar for their wives, they would also use a get mekushar for regular documents. And then it just became the standard, and that's what we call lo plug. We don't want to differentiate, because if we start differentiating, or if we start saying, oh yeah, you can do a get mekushar with only 2 signatures when it comes to your land, they might think a get mekushar could be with only 2 signatures when it comes to divorcing your wife, and that would be disqualified. Or if you think you could use a regular star for one, you might use a regular star for the divorce, and you're not supposed to because that's what the rabbis instituted. Now we'll take a break from the Gemara for a quick minute, and we'll look at Tosfot. First Tosfot on Amud Bet, Tiknu Rabbanim mekushar. So I made reference to this Tosfot before, which is Misab Galan. I don't understand. Bizman hazeh, kisha kohen megaresh ishto im tzarich lasot mekushar. In other words, I'm trying to figure out, I'm not sure if nowadays, right? Obviously, they weren't doing it, which is why he's trying to say, do kohanim have to use a get mekushar? It sounds like the rabbis instituted takana that you have to divorce your wife if you're a kohen. you must use a get mekushar as a delay tactic so that you really think twice or 3 times or 4 times before divorcing her because it's such a done deal. So now Tosfot doesn't understand, then why aren't we using these nowadays? So now he offers 3 possible answers again. But I want to, before we even get to the answers, the question is very significant because the question shows, and as we're going to see in a minute, we're going to get to a machlok and amorim, how did the witnesses sign, and they don't even know because they didn't see these documents. They weren't in use at all. So why? Like, what happened here? If there's a takana and the rabbis instituted, shouldn't every kohen who uses a document have to do this? And I'm sure there were enough kohanim that were using documents, whether divorce documents or sale documents, should have been used. So Tosfot tries to address this and offers 3 answers. The first answer is we don't really know how it works so well. We're not sure about the details, so better not to deal with it, right? This is fascinating. There's a takana to use this, but since we don't know anymore how really to do it properly, we might do it wrong. So we should just stick with the simple one that we know exactly how to do it and how to do it halachically, and therefore we won't have a problematic shtar. So we're going to override a takana of the rabbis because we're not sure how to actually fulfill the takana of the rabbis. It's kind of interesting. Inami, second option. Lo takina Rabbanan ki imbo tomakom. Maybe the rabbis only instituted for that city where there were all these kohanim that got angry so quickly. Who's to say all kohanim are like that, and maybe the problem didn't continue through future generations? Or Rihaya Omer, Ditikina Rabbanan mekushar lo shiech chova lasot. Okay, now we're going to go back and change what the original takana was. We thought the takana was every kohen who gets divorced has to do this. Maybe it wasn't chova. Maybe it wasn't obligatory even at the time. It was a good thing to do because they wanted to protect the wives, but it wasn't like you have to do this. It was just, we want to prevent future issues where the wives will get divorced and they won't be able to get remarried to their husbands again. But it wasn't a necessary, it wasn't an obligatory thing. It was just, like we saw before, it's a tova. It was good advice, but not like it was obligatory, and that could explain then why we don't do it anymore. So that's a just very interesting Tosfot. We actually learned 2 Tosfots today, which is nice. We have a short daf, we can do that. Okay, and when the Tosfots are more simple, these were easier ones. Hechan edim chotmim. So now we get to a little bit of a confusing part because it's not exactly clear what, like they're describing in words, which is what I'm trying to do, is help you understand in words what this document looked like. I did do a show and tell, so for those who are looking at the video, you can see what it looks like. But it's really hard to know how this all worked, and the rabbis are deliberating about it as well. Rav Huna Amal bein kesher lekesher. So where did Edim sign? Rav Huna says in between the folds. Okay, which right now the Gemara is going to think, or one of the rabbis is going to think that they mean. Okay, and again, I'm giving you one of the interpretations of how to interpret this. But remember, we said there was one line that was blank and one line that was filled in. So imagine the top line is the filled in one. The second line is the blank one. That's where the Edim would sign. And then they would seal it. And then the next thing, the same, a line of text, a signature, and seal. Now, the problem with this interpretation is, what did the Mishnah say? Edav me'achorav, on the backside. Well, you'd have to understand that Rav Huna thought me'achorav meant above or below, something like that. And like on the other side of that fold, meaning inside still. Okay, in the end, the Gemara is going to say that's not what he means. But that's what they're going to think of first. Rav Yirmiyahu bar Abba amal achorei haktav u'keneged haktav mibachutz. Okay, this is on the back side of it, which is what we thought originally. And opposite the wording, okay, we're also not sure exactly what this means, opposite all the wording on the outside. Okay, in the end, we're going to see that this means if the wording goes all the way down to the bottom, then the signatures are going to start at the bottom. They're going to be vertical lines going upward. So they're going to start at the bottom. What's the point of that? The point of that is to know exactly where the text ended so that there's no forgeries. So it starts at the bottom and they sign going upward. Okay, there's a bunch of pictures in the Koran that show some of this. The pictures don't exactly correspond to these 2 opinions, which would have been nicer, but they do show you with the idea of these signatures going upward, okay, and these vertical lines, and we'll get back to that. So, originally we said the number of ksharim is the number of signatures. It kind of sounded like each fold had a signature on it. According to what Rav Yirmiyahu bar Abba is saying, no, the signatures don't correspond to the folds because they're perpendicular to the folds, right? They're going vertically and the folds are going horizontally. So Again, it's a little bit confusing, but it's obvious that the reason why, and we're going to talk about this much more tomorrow, is that we want the bottom to match up with the bottom of the text. Okay, tomorrow there'll be a whole sugya about that, so we'll wait till we get there. Today we're going to deal with Rav Huna. Amalei Rami Bar Chama le Rav Chisda, the Rav Huna did. So Rami Bar Chama says to Rav Chisda, I don't understand Rav Huna. Le Rav Huna damar ben kesher lekesher, kasakadatim ben kesher lekesher mikavai. We thought he meant in between the folds on the inside. So again, on the blank line, whether it's the upper or the lower one of the two in the fold, but that's where the signature goes, inside. But that can't be from this story we're going to hear. And I mentioned that we're going to have this story with Rebbe, who didn't really understand about getting mekushar, which kind of shows that by the time Rebbe came along at the end of the Tufav, the Tanaim, they weren't really using them, or at least where he was, they weren't. So Rami Bar Chisda says, if you say that Rav Huna is talking about the kesher on the inside, there was a case of a get mekushar that came in front of Rebbe. Rebbe said, what a problematic document. There's no date on it. Now, why was there no date? Well, because he got the document and it was all folded and all he saw was the text at the bottom and there was no date in it. He didn't understand the way a get mekushar worked and that the signature, that the date was on the inside of the folds. His son, for some reason, knew, Amarle Rabbi Shimon Berebi, or I don't know if he really knew, but he said, Li Rebbe, he said to his father, Shema ben sharav muvla. Look, I see this document is folded and sealed. Maybe inside those seals is where the date is. What does this have to do with the witnesses? You'll see in a minute. Because again, we're trying to figure out how it can't be that the witnesses were on the inside, and you'll see why in a minute. So Palye v'chazye, so he tore open the document and saw, in fact, the date was inside and realized, oh, this is a valid document. V'im ita, if the Eidim were on the inside, then what should the story have been saying? It should have said, Ein zman b'zeh ve'ein Eidim b'zeh mebayele. Rebbe should have said, what a problematic document. There's no date and there's no signatures. But obviously he saw the signatures. Why did he see the signatures? Because they must have been on the outside and not inside the folds. If it's on the outside, again, accordion. Okay, if you're not viewing my picture, but if it's on the outside, then it must be, right? You'll be able to see it because it's not inside the fold, it's outside the document. So it must be from that story that he didn't complain there's no witnesses here. It must be that it was on the outside. Okay, so now we explain. It must be on the outside, and the assumption is, okay, that, right, I'll write it down. Ploni, ben ploni, ed. Now, if it's on the outside, it must be on each of the folds. Okay, so each fold has a signature, like I said before. That must be what Rav Huna thinks, as opposed to Rav Yirmiyahu Bar Abba, who we're going to say thinks that it's going right from the bottom, written up this way. Okay, ploni ben ploni ed, going upward, crossing over each fold, basically, because it's perpendicular. So now we're going to have another question. If the witness is signed on the top, on this fold, on this fold, on that fold, what's the problem? Going back to our check issue. The problem is the witnesses don't appear at the bottom of the document. So anyone can add words on this part and add in some sort of other obligation. I sold my house to you, and then, and everything in it. Add those words, and then, that changes everything. So the Gemara asks, Amarle, in other words, so first, I didn't read this inside, but let's go back to read this. So Rebbe proved from the Rebbe story, basically Rami Bar Chama says, it can't possibly be it's on the inside, to which Rav Chisda answers Rami Bar Yechezkel, Amarle, mi savar ben kesher lekesher mikavai, lo ben kesher lekesher me'abarai. Okay, that's what I already told you, but now we'll read it inside, which is, he didn't mean that they were on the inside. Rav Huna meant they were on the outside, as I did in this picture. But now the question is, v'nichush dil mazief v'katav ma'debai v'chatim esadeh. Maybe, right, we have the witnesses signed at the top, and then someone could have added at the bottom. Because again, if you take a regular document, you write everything in it, and right below the wording, the Eidim sign. In this document, the Eidim are signed at the top. And there's no way to know that this is the end, or this was the end when they signed, and maybe someone added. It's a big problem. To which they answered, Dichtiv be sharir v'kayam. The last words you write in the document are, this is sharir v'kayam. This stands, it's like period. This is the end. Okay, it's like saying the end in a book. Hakol Shariur V'Kayam. By the way, you have a ketubah in your house, you can look, or you go to a wedding and you hear someone read the ketubah. The end of the ketubah, they say Hakol Bariur V'Shariur V'Kayam. Okay, this is clear and set and established, and as if this is the end. Those are the last words. So now they say nichush. Okay, that doesn't resolve it because so that would resolve it right now because we have Adam signed at the top. At the bottom, they add the words Hakol Shariur V'Kayam. The witnesses will only sign once that's written. And then we're done. Okay, there's no concern for forgery. Gemara says, what do you mean there's no concern? Okay, maybe they wrote what they wrote. In other words, they could have written Shariur V'Kayam, and then they could have added a section and written Hakol Shariur V'Kayam. And then maybe the witnesses signed after the first Shariur V'Kayam and not the second one. And how will we ever know? To which they answer, no, that's obviously not a problem because the rules are Chad Shariur V'Kayam Katvina, Trei Shariur V'Kayam Lo Katvina. You're only allowed to write Shariur V'Kayam once in a document. You can't write it twice, exactly to avoid this problem. So since it can only be written once, that's not a problem. But we always have to be concerned for issues like what if maybe it was written, it was erased, and now the Shariur V'Kayam is replacing the first one. But maybe when the witnesses signed, it was the first one they were signing on, and then it got erased. So now the Gemara says, no, we're not worried about erasures. Why not? Or that someone erased the word specifically, Shariur V'Kayam. You're allowed to erase words in a get. Now they're going to explain. Ha'amar Rabbi Yochanan, tluya mekuyemet kshera. This is something different, but we're quoting Rabbi Yochanan. Right, when in the back in the old days, I mean nowadays too, but usually we don't write as much. Everything's typed, and you can always fix what you typed and add in words and edit it. But if you wrote something and you missed a word, what do? Right, you put that upside down V, that little thing, and then you write the word above. That's a tluya. It's a hanging word because it's on its own line. Right, it's higher than all the other words. If it was mekuyemet, so what they would do in a document, if you forgot a word, they wouldn't start from the beginning. It was a whole big deal to write documents. So what did they do? They would add a little word on the line above, and they would write at the bottom of the document, on line 6, this word was added, and then they signed. Okay, like you would fix a check, and you would put your name next to the mistake you made. I'm just going to read a little bit more, so we finish this. Mechak pasul, ba'afa pisha mekuyam. But if you erased, and then you wrote down at the bottom, on line 6, this was erased, that's not good. Okay, that doesn't work. But when we say erase is no good, lo amaru machak pasul, ela bimkom Shariur V'Kayam ukishiur Shariur V'Kayam. You are allowed to erase things and write at the bottom, there was something erased on this line, blah, blah, blah. But not if it's in the place where Shariur V'Kayam usually appears, and not if it's the amount of letters, right, spaces that could be the words Shariur V'Kayam. So we're not worried that somebody erased Shariur V'Kayam, because if they did, first of all, erasures are always noticeable, especially on a parchment. So if it was erased, if there's some erased section where Shariur V'Kayam normally is, and it's the amount of spaces of Shariur V'Kayam, then it's a disqualified document. So we're not worried about forgeries, basically, because we write Shariur V'Kayam at the bottom, and we're not worried someone erased and added. We're not worried someone added another Shariur V'Kayam, because that's also a disqualified document. So that's how we explain Rav Huna. Okay, we're going to start next time with Rav Yirmiyahu bar Abba and try to understand how his opinion fits in, how the witnesses sign, and how we avoid forgeries according to his opinion. So what we saw today was this issue of a get pashut and a get mekushar. Really, our issue was the get mekushar. Get pashut, everybody knows. We're now talking about this unique. We learned where it came from. We learned, number one, what the differences are, the two halachic differences between a get mekushar and a get pashut. We learned what the sources are for it, even though we said in the end it's not really the source. It's just 3 psukim that one can kind of learn from there, but it's sort of alluded to, or you can make an allusion to it, but it's not really that it was learned from there. It's really an ordinance of the rabbis because of this issue of the kohanim in this particular town that would divorce their wives very quickly, and they wanted to prevent that. And then we moved from, and then they didn't differentiate between, any document they had to write. It had to be a get mekushar, so that they would write get mekushars for their wives. And then we had this machlokah Rav Huna, Rav Yirmiyahu bar Abba, where the witnesses would sign. First, we understood Rav Huna was on the inside. Then we explained, no, it's really on the outside, based on Rebbe's story. And then what about forgeries? And that we resolved, right? If it was on the inside, then, I guess on the inside, even if it was at the top on the inside, you'd still have to worry about forgeries. But anyway, the forgeries are, once we understand what it is, then they started asking, what about forgeries? And we resolved that. And tomorrow we'll get back to Rav Yirmiyahu bar Abba. Wishing everyone a good day and a chodesh tov.